So I'm Anu Kumar. I am president and CEO of Ipas. Ipas is a global reproductive justice organization that focuses on access to abortion and contraception around the world, including in the United States. And so the work that we do is we take very much an abortion ecosystem approach. So abortion isn't the only, services aren't the only thing that matters around abortion. There's much more that's involved. And we also link abortion to other issues and see its connection to things like gender-based violence and climate justice and many other issues that are relevant. So just in terms of thinking, where we are right now in the reproductive justice movement globally, if you think about the three major components of reproductive justice, to have children, to not have children, to be able to parent children safely in communities, globally we've spent a lot of time on not having children. So contraception, family planning, abortion, these are all things that are actually quite well covered and have been for decades around the world. Having children, that is fertility care and all that's involved in that, is not really much discussed, at least in the global landscape, which is, I think, a pretty significant gap. And then parenting safely, that's pretty much untouched entirely. That is not really something that's discussed globally. It is discussed in the United States a lot more, but it doesn't have that same kind of cachet overseas. So the abortion issue in the US, of course, is in the news all the time. I've never seen so much media coverage of abortion ever. And it's very much the case that the United States is completely out of step with the rest of the world. We heard this yesterday. But just to give you a little bit of a statistic, since 1970, 125 countries have liberalized abortion. But the United States is not one of them. And so we actually join a very small group of countries that have moved backwards. And while that may, obviously is deeply traumatic for Americans, it also has a huge impact in the rest of the world. Essentially, what happens overseas is what happens eventually in America. So the Helms Amendment, which is an amendment to the U.S. Foreign Assistance Act, which is 50 years old, is still very much in place, and it's interpreted as a ban on the use of U.S. government funds for abortion care. Well, its domestic corollary is the Hyde Amendment. We have the global gag rule, which comes into place depending on who's in power, and its domestic corollary is the domestic gag rule on Title X money. It's the same playbook. It's the same set of issues. So we have an obligation, I think, to really think about the US in the rest of the world and how the rest of the world can contribute to what's happening in the United States. So, really placing the US firmly on the globe as part of the planet, which seems like not such a radical thing to say, but apparently it is. So our discussion today with our panelists is around what's happening in the US, what can we learn from overseas, and what does this moment mean for feminist funding? So let me introduce our panelists. I'll start with Lolan Sevilla. Lolan is with Funders for Justice. Next to Lolan is Lupe Rodriguez. Lupe is Executive Director for the National Latina Institute for Reproductive Justice. Sitting next to Lupe is Tesmerelna Atsbeha, who is Senior Program Officer for Women's Rights at Wellspring Philanthropic Fund. And next to me is Natalie Collier, who is President and founder of the Lighthouse Black Girls Project. Let me begin with Lupe. Lupe, I'd be interested in your thoughts on how decriminalization, surveillance, censorship, how is that all playing out in what you see in the United States right now?
Well, thank you. This is on, okay. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for having me today, and thank you for that question, Anu. I'll start by sharing a little bit about Latina Institute, the National Latina Institute for Reproductive Justice. We go by Latina Institute for short. And the work that we do and how we're based in reproductive justice and the reproductive justice framework and how that drives the work and then as connected to the question. Our work is, centers the folks who are most impacted by abortion bans and by inequities that have existed in this country for a long time and among them are Black women, LGBTQ folks, and Latinx community members, indigenous folks. And in the Latinx community, we work a lot at like the intersections of issues that are affecting our communities closely. And so for us, reproductive justice is really about thinking about these questions about whether to have children, when to have children, if you can have children, how you raise them, et cetera, in the context of the lived experience of people's existence and their lives, and how that connects to things like economic insecurity or economic inequities, how that connects to immigrant inequities, the terrible immigration system we have in this country, how that connects to climate change and other kinds of injustice in communities. And so we organize with people, and part of what how our work is guided is by centering the lived experiences, the stories, the community-informed perspective, or using community information to guide the work that we do otherwise in policy, in communications and narrative shift, and in other ways. And so one of the things that is guiding a lot of the federal policy work, for example, that we're doing, and the advocacy and organizing that we're doing, is what we're seeing on the ground right now post-Dobbs around surveillance in one of the states where we organize deeply, which is South Texas, or one region where we organize deeply, which is South Texas in the Rio Grande Valley. And what we're seeing there is that people, well, first of all, there have existed a myriad of barriers to care there for many years before Roe, and I think that before Roe fell, and that's like a really important point that we always want to make, that like a lot of folks, even before the fall of Roe, did not have easy access to care in those places because of, distance of health centers, because of issues of immigration fears, right? Like enforcement mechanisms that were used in different clinics or in different communities to curb travel and access in different ways. But what we're seeing now is like a heightened use of that kind of like, law enforcement across the board, like CBP officers, along with other kinds of police and other people to patrol, places where people are traveling. So there are checkpoints that people have to travel if they wanted to leave states to get access to care, and again, potentially facing, separation from their families if they can't produce documentation. We're seeing, so that kind of form of surveillance and monitoring of people's movement. We're seeing that there's in this Texas specifically, and not just in the Rio Grande Valley, there's empowerment, I don't know what you call it, but like people are being empowered, like private citizens are being empowered to monitor clinics and hospitals and other healthcare providers to see who's coming in and out, to be able to, to sue people under the vigilante law that exists in Texas. And so we've seen like an uptick and reporting around like people having that experience when they're trying to get care. So in addition to, also again, the overuse of law enforcement of different kinds in the state that's keeping people from getting care, we're seeing that as well. And so all of that, I think, is connected to this because, we think about, when we're talking about resources that exist for people to like leave the state, right? We keep thinking about, okay, well, maybe these states for now will not have access to care, and so, but the people can leave, right? Or we can get the people out so they can get this care. For many, it's not a reality to be able to do that, and even to get other kinds of care that they might need in this moment beyond abortion care, which they're not able to get. We're seeing that they're being deterred from getting that care as well because of the surveillance, this monitoring, and that's only gotten worse. But I think again, it is important to say that existed before the fall of Roe.
Thank you so much, Lupe. Yeah, you make an excellent point that things weren't exactly perfect before the Dobbs decision. We had a lot of problems already, and it's just made things far more difficult. Lolan, I'd be interested in your point of view on this, and particularly. Also, if you could touch on what does it mean for supporting some of the work?
Thank you for that, and thank you for this question. Really honored to be in this space with all of you. If you're not familiar with Funders for Justice, we're a donor organizing platform for funders who are moving money and resource to grassroots organizations, folks who are on the ground, folks who are in it in the day, day in, day out. I think for us who are supporting funders, who are taking an organizing approach to organize the sector in order to build that power and resource for movements who are in the trenches. I think I've appreciated hearing in all of the sessions today, trust movements, right? These are folks who know the solutions, have known solutions, are building the alternatives to harmful institutions and systems that are targeting communities and criminalizing communities. And so in this post-Dobbs, the year plus after the Dobbs decision, what I've been seeing in this role of organizing funders is that folks are actually actively making those connections around de-siloing movements and intersectionality of movements, and having those brave conversations about how do we flank folks on the ground using our particular privileges that we have access to. We're seeing folks who are funders who are actively thinking about the safety and security of their grantee partners. And so what does that mean to fund safety and security for folks who going into work, doing the work of building power in their communities, are being arrested, are being targeted, and that funders have a particular responsibility in this role of access to meet grantee partners where they're at. And so for our members at Funders for Justice, we're creating a political home where folks can have those conversations with one another to move beyond, those elephants in the room, the ways that the sector inherently builds silos in between like movements and communities, and how can we support the active targeting of folks who are, just simply by trans folks who are trying to seek gender-affirming care and are actually experiencing violence in ERs or by medical providers, being arrested. We're seeing trans kids who are being removed from their homes, as we heard from the democracy panel earlier. I forget the gentleman who was on the Emmett, yes, who was very brilliant and vulnerable in sharing his experiences in Texas. And so we're seeing that across the country. We're seeing it across the globe. And what is the role of funders in flanking not only movement, but one another to organize institutions, to move monies where it needs to go, to trust movement organizers in what they need to be funded with, long-term investments, and getting out of the way. So, I think folks are also being able to make the connection between, we're really good at funding reform, and when we talk about what are the alternatives, whether you want to call it abolition, whether you want to call it future building, that we are in a very particular privilege to be able to make those intersections that we're hearing folks on the ground constantly in all these sessions. We've heard the same helpful echo chambers, but what folks on the ground are saying isn't anything new, right? Fund us at scale, fund us, Gen Ops funding, and I think what is the work we need to do in this room together to be able to actually meet grantee partners and where they're at. And so I think in this moment post-Dobbs, you have a lot of institutions, folks within institutions who are actually wrestling with those elephant in the room conversations, and how can we actually leverage these types of spaces to help movement. And I'm here in this space to, I'm here to hustle. I'm here to make those connections. I'm here to actually, as an organizer, bring folks to the organizing table, to invite you all in to what that looks like. And I'm curious, of the folks here, raise your hand if you identify as an organizer. Yeah, I love that. There's a lot of folks who are here. And what that means is we're coming together, we're finding solutions, and we are we're taking the direction of movement at what they've been saying, been yelling at funders for decades, and now is a time post-Dobbs where we're actually seeing funders take that organizing ethos into their institutions, into these types of spaces to really figure out how to. Sorry, I'm trying not to cuss. I'm trying to be a little less. Anyways, but I'll pause there. That. Listen to movement, listen to your grantee partners, and find those ways that you can have, whether you have portfolios that you're managing, whether you have other forms of funding, right? Because I think that's also the thing that we're trying to organize around is there's so much money, there's so many ways that it's actually allocated or designated within institutions, and really what we want to do is get that stuff on the ground, invest in scale, and that is having those types of conversations out in the open with one another is a very real shift in this post-Dobbs place.
Thank you so much, Lolan. Yeah, I mean, the fundamental job of the funder is to fund. Move the money. Move it out, move it to the people who need it, make it happen. I think that's the tourism of the funding community, right? So you're right, we gotta move. Let me bring in Natalie here and then Tesmer. Natalie, I'm curious from your experience and what you see. Are you seeing this on the ground? Are you seeing feminist funding happening? What does it look like? What is your advice? What is, how the panel is called has the word bold in it, right? How can we be bold?
I bring you greetings from Jackson, Mississippi. Disparagingly at one point called, but now lovingly referred to as the Republic of Jafrica. Do I see this challenge to be bold happening in funding? No, I do not.
Short answer.
That's my full sentence. No, I do not. I particularly don't see it in the South. I think those of us who live, operate, work in alongside, who are and work alongside people who are marginalized often have to prove that we are worthy of being funded, right? The work that we are doing. And that is particularly the case when that work is intersecting work. I think we can all agree about that. That is even more so the case when that work is happening in the U.S. South. So we heard earlier about the 5% of funding going to work that is specifically for girls and women and non-binary folks, and 1.5% of that. Okay, so even less of that goes to Southern folks, right? And so I think a part of that for me is not only a requirement that I prove that that funders require that I prove that I am worthy to be funded because of these marginalizations, but then there is another marginalization that comes because I live in the South. And then not only do I live in the South, but I live in the Deep South. Right, so when I started the Lighthouse 7 years ago, I got questions all the time about why would I choose to put the organization in Jackson, Mississippi, and not Atlanta or Charlotte or, you know, some of these larger southern cities. But that is where the work is happening. That is where the people are most often ignored. So when we talk about a post-Dobbs world, for example, in the frame of reproductive justice, and we're talking about access to abortion or not, in a post-Dobbs world, and you know, Dr. Dobbs, I talked with Dr. Dobbs, very cool guy, by the way, but in a post-Dobbs world, in the state of Mississippi, we have been operating prior to that for at least a decade with only one clinic where one could access an abortion. So the post-Dobbs world that many of you are talking about, we had already been living in that world, right? We are living now in a world where our Attorney General, Lynn Fitch, has made complaints about HIPAA, so that if I travel across state lines to access an abortion and I come back, then I can be criminalized for that. So a lot of the conversations that we are having right now, folks in the state of Mississippi not only have already been living with those conditions, but we've been organizing around those for a very long time. So a thing that I tell people often is that we are trailblazers in ways that a lot of folks don't acknowledge. And I think that is because we are looking for, so one thing we need to do, this is not a B, let me see. B, besides being bold, be radically imaginative in the way we define things. So what are our metrics? How are we really measuring things, right? So if your measure is just about whether or not, I'm sorry, this is a poor example, but I hope you'll track. If the metric is whether or not we were able to keep the abortion clinic open, we will always fail that metric. We will always fail that metric. There has, since post-Reconstruction, there has been nothing surprising about the way the state of Mississippi government operates. Like, there just hasn't been. Even Ray Mabus, Democratic governor, I mean, you know, like, he gave, you know, a trinket here or there, but there are only so many things that you can do. So a lot of this work that we are doing is about resistance and dreaming up new ways of doing things and subverting systems. And so if your metric is about how do we counter a system, and how do we reform a system, for a lot of us, we're never going to win. So that's 1B. I think it's also about being curious and being in community. I know that program officers, program directors, program whoever, I know that you have responsibilities, just like we have responsibilities, but you can't, you take a person plural, not pointing fingers at any person, but you can't get to the place that you understand the things that you are requiring and requesting of us don't make sense for us in our context without relationship. So I think community and curiosity are really important. And then one more thing I think is being self-reflective. If there are, in your attempts to be radically imaginative, if there are opportunities to fund work that looks different than work that you have been accustomed to funding, and your initial response is to remind yourself to keep a poker face or not to roll your eyes, these are natural responses, then it is, what's that about for me? Like self-reflecting, what is that about? And what does whatever that is about, what does that have to do with the ways that I have been steeped in patriarchy and anti-blackness and capitalism and, the list could go on. And then how do I counter that? Yeah, I'll stop right there.
Thank you. Thank you. That was very thoughtful and provocative. Thank you for that. So we'll come back to some of these themes. I remember from the previous panel, one of the panelists said we need to be wrong more often. And that reminds me of your call to be self-reflective and to connect the dots. It was something that both Lupe and Lolan mentioned. Tesmer, I know you work a lot globally, and so shifting the lens a little bit and thinking about global work. So how do you see this moment and how we can be bolder as feminist funders? What are the opportunities? And bring us into the conversation about what we can learn from outside the U.S.
Sure, thank you, Anu. Good afternoon, everyone. Tesmerelna Atsbeha. I work in the philanthropy space at a private foundation as a senior program officer on the women's rights team, managing a portfolio. We talked about portfolios in the last session, focused on reproductive equity, primarily in Latin America, but part of a team that also works in the US. So I'm really excited. I feel like a big responsibility being in a panel entitled Just Reproductive Justice. That's a lot. There's a lot of lineage here that I wanted to bring into the room. I think in particular, Anu referenced, where does the reproductive justice come from? Where does this framework come from? And just acknowledging those, foremothers who brought this in, who created this lineage. And, as a group of Black women who were in the international space seeing human rights frameworks and thinking about what that could mean for the reproductive justice or reproductive rights at that time movement. And the brilliance of that political vision, I think probably at a time when there wasn't a recognition or even wasn't, as you were saying, the radical reimagining, that it didn't probably seem very likely that we would be able to be sitting in this room in a panel that's entitled Reproductive Justice. So I just want to bring that lineage in to the room, and also the lineage, because of my experience in the last 8 years supporting work in Latin America, of feminist movements in Latin America, and the amazing creativity, imagination, and brilliance, and recognition of the need for all of the different intelligences and all of the different types of work to make it happen. I could go on and on about that. And those of you who know me, get a glass of wine in my hand, and I will tell you lots of stories of how much I'm in awe of that work. And so bringing those lineages in, I think, and then thinking about what does it mean to be bold. And I want to reflect a little bit on my own personal journey as a philanthropist, or person working in philanthropy, and be a little bit vulnerable in talking about the things that I got wrong. And I think, I want to acknowledge too that my pathway was through international development. So I, trained in public health and worked in international development, being based mostly in Eastern and Southern Africa for about 10, 11 years before coming back to the US, working at the United Nations at UN Women, and then in policy, and then came over to work in philanthropy. So obviously there's a lot of things that I needed to unlearn, things that I had equated with definitions of success, definitions of scale, understanding of what it means to make progress and to advance work. And so I think this has been, my 8 years in philanthropy, I think, have been the first couple years trying to figure out what the heck I was doing, and then from there unlearn all of the things that I learned before to be in better or right relationship. And I think that's the sort of, when I think about being bold, that's really what I think about. And I think when I took over this portfolio that I'm managing, it was called legalization. So you get an idea of where we put our focus, right? And we were thinking like, okay, we're only going to contexts where there's an opportunity for decriminalization or legalization. So it was very opportunistic on many, not necessarily along for, the long haul, and also very much about one way, one dimension, one very narrow dimension. And I think through work that we've done, both, as a team, as a foundation, as individuals, and in community, we have learned so much from our grantee partners about how that doesn't work. And I have, crystallized in my memory specific moments when very kindly and gently grantee partners would correct me in my misunderstanding or, not understanding what actually this needed to be, and help me expand my understanding. And also other funding partners that I've been in community with in, organizing groups like Funders for Justice, Funders for Reproductive Equity, where you have space to have those kind of conversations. So I think it is, we want to be open to, not seeing this in a binary of like good or bad practice, but everyone on a journey to improve their practice. So one of, some of the ways, just to be really concrete around this, I think we have a lot of siloing particularly in the repro field, around what we see as service delivery and what we see as policy advocacy. And then kind of like some culture work, but it's very new or newish. And I think that this binary is very unhelpful, and it's something that we are unlearning. And I think it takes, as Toronto was talking about, knowing that we have to present things, up the chain or up the flagpole, and how are we being creative in terms of thinking about explaining these strategies and going beyond these metrics or these frameworks that are very much focused on quantitative evaluation in terms of service delivery, which I think comes from very instrumentalist ideas, right? Of like a service is not the realization of a right, right? And that I think that type of work is difficult work, and part of the reason why I feel like we have to be very nimble. And when Lola's saying, raise your hand if you're an organizer, I think I raise my hand because I think often about how are we nimble in terms of organizing with other partners. There are instances when I have another funding partner who I know has different flexibilities than I do, and when I realize that, okay, this isn't something I'm going to be able to get through our systems, I call them in and like, how can we work together to do this? Or other teams at Wellspring who work in other programmatic areas, like how can we work together to define this or refine this in a way that can be understood internally. I think redefining risk is another area. We have all of the ability to fund a white guy with a vision. That's what venture capital and angel investors do, right? They're like, oh, this guy has this vision, let's throw $1 million at it. And when it comes to women of color with vision, brilliant visions, it's like, oh, well, maybe we can do a proof of concept. Maybe I'll give you a planning grant. Like, here's a little. We're just, not trusting women of color, and particularly black women, in the same way. And I think that is a lot of, Natalie's saying, be curious. Be curious about why that is and why we feel the need to put folks through paces and not in other areas. And we have, in my foundation, we have other areas of work, that look at economic development, et cetera. And there's a lot of research. And I actually have another portfolio that's really steeped in research. And I think in particular, that's where a lot of this comes from, is this idea that certain pedigrees bring this sort of validation. I think we have to really re-examine that. We have to really re-examine where that's coming from and who has the privilege or who has the right to be developing knowledge and be thinking about different epistemologies, like actually where is knowledge coming from? Because there's a lot of partners out there, and I think specifically in relation to repro, when we think about medication abortion accompaniment, mutual aid, a lot of these strategies are coming from community, coming from movement, and the knowledge bearers are not people who are bringing necessarily academic degrees, but they have 20 years of accompanying people through abortions. And that, to me, having seen what they've seen, that's more valuable than having an academic degree, right? And I think that when we think about what we're reimagining for our future, and we think about access, it's not just about getting into a clinic, right? Especially if these health systems have traumatized people with marginalized identities, for generations. It's about rethinking what access means. So, sorry, it's a little bit of a tangent, but I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Many really interesting ideas and themes. I just wanted to pick up on one thing you said about silos. You mentioned the silos that continue in the funding community. So I've seen this for quite some time. We have thematic silos, as you've mentioned, but we also have geographic silos. So the U.S., again, is not really actually considered part of the world. And so there is domestic programming, and then there's global programming. And believe me, as an organization that's tried to do both, it is really not easy to raise money as a global organization to work in the U.S. Ipas is squarely in the box of global, even though we've been doing 50 years of work on abortion, and guess what? The U.S. could use our expertise right about now. But it is a huge challenge. And then geographically, even further, in the U.S. and elsewhere, the country is divided up. Some funders are funding the South, some funders are funding particular states, there's just and I get it, I understand that there are reasons behind all of these things, but it makes it really challenging at the end of the day for people to raise the money that they need to do the work that needs to be done. So there's all kinds of siloing, and then there's issues. There's like we were talking only about reproductive justice, but economic empowerment or gender-based violence, or these are considered separate programmatic areas in many donors. And so, where is the intersectionality, I guess, in the donor community is a question. I'm going to ask each of you to maybe give one statement around a recommendation, a very concrete recommendation that you have for feminist funders to shift, change, do something. Just one quick thing, because we're running out of time. I realize this clock in front of me is ticking down. So I do want to have open it up for questions from all of you. So let me start with you, Lupe, since we began with you. What do you suggest? What's your one sentence? Do this, please.
I'm thinking really hard about one sentence. I think
you could be.
I think it's been said, and I'll echo more strongly about really recognizing the moment that we're in, and that replicating the or continuing to invest in the things that we've always done that like got us here is not a way out of this.
That's right.
And so I think to the points that were made, right, about like if the metric is going to be that we keep a clinic open or that we pass this like piece of legislation in a state of Congress that like isn't going to move anything anytime soon, right? Like is that really a place where we should continue to invest? And maybe should we think about, I mean, we should think about, I challenge the room to think about the part of the ecosystem, as Natalie mentioned, that isn't given and has never been given the resources that we need to right-size the power, to have the right power dynamics that we need to actually pass policy. Like we've never actually invested in communities to hold folks accountable in power, to change structures, we've never, again, invested in building that power. And I think we're finding that's changed slightly, I think, post-Dobbs. There's a little bit more like recognition that we need to do some things differently, but it hasn't changed drastically enough to really, I think, engender the kind of change that we need to see.
Be bolder is your recommendation. Be bolder, invest more. Yeah, Lolan.
Invest differently, I'd say.
Invest differently.
Yeah.
One is, if you don't have a political home, find a political home. Being in community, having these hard conversations, actually infusing how you approach funding through an organizing lens, I think will help spark, will just help spark something. As someone who has been an organizer for all my life and has been in this role of organizing my program officers, and had to write so many grant applications that required so much forward thinking and creativity to solutions on the ground. I pose that same thing to funders, right? Like, where's the bold vision? Where's the creativity? Where's the partnership with your grantee partners in a way that, like, you're flanking them and you're building solid relationship that really hears and addresses the needs of what folks are needing.
Thank you. Get organized, build relationships, go deep. Yeah. Tesmer, do you want to go next or Natalie? Natalie looks deep in thought. Should we let you think some more? All right. I can let you think some
Make
more.
it be like a sentence and a half.
Okay.
Recognize that the same silos in which you operate facilitate the recapitulation of the neocolonialism you say that you want to undo.
Nicely done. Nicely done. Excellent. Tesmer.
That's deep.
That's why she was deep in thought.
I will quote someone who I am really inspired by, Adrienne Marie Brown. She talks a lot about being in right relationship. And I think for funders, being in right relationship, and oftentimes that means ceding power and control. And I think that is something that, particularly as a woman of color working in philanthropy, you model like what you see. And so it can be hard if you haven't really seen anyone who looks like you doing, being in control of resources at this level. Like it can be difficult to take it in a different direction. It can be difficult to do things differently. But what I've seen is when that, being in relationship happens, and when you're in deep relationship and in community, that's when you're really able to change things. I think that's when you're really able to have those quote unquote results from the strategies, that when it's just in your mind and you go off in a corner and you get to write your own strategy and you get to do your own thing, that's not really what's making change. That's not really shifting things. Like, the folks who are closer to communities are the ones who need to be having the control over the resources and making these decisions. And the reality is, there's a distance, and we are playing a role as a bridge, and that bridge, like, there's a need to have that in this current iteration of capitalism that we're in, because this is the way, but we're trying to change that. But also, like, you need to kind of be okay with letting go of that in order to make these shifts in the way that we want to make these shifts. So I think being in right relationship and finding, a way to do that and manage, it does require managing both sides, right? Managing relationships on both sides, and it doesn't mean that that's easy. It's not to say, oh, just do that. No, it is difficult on both sides.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you to our panelists. We have about 15 minutes, actually, 10, 15 minutes. So if there are questions from our audience, please, I have more questions for our panelists, but I also want to just, if you have questions, comments, please raise your hand. I think I can pass this mic around to somebody. Yes, please. Yeah. On the front row.
Oui, merci beaucoup. Moi, c'est Julien Lusenge. Hein? Oui, moi, c'est Julien Lusenge. Je viens de la République démocratique du Congo.
My name is Julienne Osenge. I come from DRC.
Oui, la question de la santé, la reproduction, la justice dont on parle, je pense qu'il faudrait vraiment les considérer et essayer d'analyser un peu plus qu'est-ce qui arrive.
The issue of health and sexual health and rights that we are talking about and justice is really important. We need to analyze it in a deeper way.
Qu'est-ce qu'il y a avec les femmes dans les communautés? Comment ça se passe dans les communautés?
At the level of communities, what's going on with women?
Dans les milieux en conflit, comment ça se passe? Les femmes déplacées, comment ça se passe?
In the conflict areas, women who are migrating because of war and conflict.
C'est très important parce que oui, on parle de ça, on les sensibilise, on les informe. On est partenaire avec Ipas. On les informe, mais parfois, il y a rupture où elles se trouvent dans des conditions où elles ne peuvent pas avoir le matériel.
So we talk about that, we sensitize them, we teach them, but sometimes there's a problem because they can't have the materials that they need.
La confiance que nous devons avoir entre nous d'abord et puis les grands donateurs avec les autres qui doivent redistribuer. Il faut vraiment une confiance. Ce qu'elle a dit, c'est très vrai.
So what she said is very true because we
on n'a
need
pas
to...
confiance aux femmes de couleur. Les femmes noires, mobiliser les ressources. Vous voulez parler, vous devez expliquer, chercher à convaincre avec des mots pour qu'on vous croie que vous êtes en train de faire le travail.
So we need to trust each other, and the donors need to trust us. When we are women of colors, it's very challenging. We have to strive to convince them, give so many explanations.
Donc, ma question pour vous, c'est de voir comment, à le niveau où on est ici, dans les conférences, comment rapprocher ce niveau avec celles qui en ont besoin, qui ont besoin de ce service tous les jours pour comprendre.
So my question is that is whatever you said here, and which is really great, how can we implement it at the local level, the people who need it the most, the women who need it the most?
Enfin, je voudrais aussi vous dire l'obstacle que nous avons, c'est la mentalité.
The obstacle that we have is mentality.
Je vais vous donner un exemple d'une infirmière dans un hôpital
there's this nurse in a hospital.
Les femmes venaient pour demander l'avortement après viol.
So after a rape, women will come to ask for abortion.
Mais elle, l'infirmière, parce elle se dit chrétienne, elle ne traduisait pas aux agents de MSF ce que la dame demandait. Elle dit non, la dame dit qu'elle veut garder.
Oh, the nurse
On a vraiment un gros travail.
supposedly a Christian was not forwarding the information regarding the request for abortion to the people who were supposed to perform it. Thank you.
Merci.
Yeah, excellent questions and comment. Yeah, so how do we translate this down to the grassroots level? How do we deal with stigma and poverty and all sorts of barriers at the service delivery level? One of the things, of course, this is part of the work that Ipas does. I mean, we actually have, one of the reasons that we're here is that Ipas has a collaborative fund. We give resources to community organizations around the world and also in the United States so that they can, and guess what, they're unrestricted grants. They're unrestricted to any of these community organizations so that they can organize and do what they think is best in their communities. But I think the challenges that you raise around how to reach these grassroots organizations is significant because there are so many even barriers in place, IRS barriers, legal regulatory barriers in place to making that happen. But I wonder if anyone on the panel wishes to respond, maybe Tesmer, since you have a lot of experience in work doing international grant making.
Yeah, I mean, I think that they lifted up a lot of the barriers that I think are seen across the board in many different settings. The stigma coming from healthcare workers themselves, the confusion oftentimes about legal frameworks, which can be very unclear and have different conditions in which it's legal under the following 3 conditions, and then the determination, as we're learning in the U.S., can be a very conservative interpretation of that. And I think it's helpful to hear about some of that context in here and bring that into the room. So thank you.
Yeah, and just one point on that. So you may not all be aware, but abortion actually is legal in the DRC for multiple indications, and programs are being implemented. But this is the kind of barrier that we face, where individual providers may not be aware of it or have their own opinions and their own points of view. And then in the humanitarian sector, as you point out, in conflict zones, abortion is rarely provided. If ever provided. Nearly 95% of all humanitarian programs do not include abortion, and many of them do not include contraception, even for women who are raped, which is nearly 1 in 3 women who are raped in conflict zones. So this is an extremely serious problem, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that the U.S. government is a huge bilateral donor in the humanitarian sector, billions and billions of dollars. Just imagine the hundreds of billions of dollars that are going right now to Ukraine, which has legal abortion, but none of that, not a penny of that, is going towards abortion care, even for women who are being raped and are experiencing pregnancy as a result of rape or incest, or their life is in danger because of the Helms Amendment. Sorry, I will now stop. Makes me mad, can you tell? Yes, exactly. Other comments or questions from the group? Yes, please. Here.
Thank you. My name is Karen Mulhauser, and I live 2 miles from here in Capitol Hill in Washington. And I had been the executive director of NARAL back in the 70s and early 80s. And in recent years, I have been spending most of my time on elections. And I have funded and organized women's groups, even the nonpartisan women's groups, to get involved in elections, to register and get out the vote. And I wonder if there's much funding for that kind of activity, and if so, I can tell you some great organizations that need the funding.
Usually there's a lot of activity around elections. Lolan, others who want, but yeah, please.
I'll just jump in and say that, I think that part of my comment earlier about like investing differently, I think also involves like that kind of work as well around like civic engagement and democracy, and like who is considered and what groups are considered as being a part of that or having an effect in elections and in work related to voter engagement. Because many organizations can't have 501c4 arms that allow them to do more electoral, like candidate-specific work, and so are limited to like organizing with voters to just get them out, to do education. And I think while there's support for that, I think it often goes to like bigger groups that have like a longer kind of track record of work in that area, and there's I think a lack of investment in groups that are working with like specific communities or working with people in specific languages or like languages that are not English. I think there's not a lot of investment with those communities, so I feel like increasing that is really important. And then I'll just say that like on the 501c4 side, I know that this has like lots of deep implications that I, as a person who's not a funder, don't really understand entirely, but I think there is a lack of funding there too. And so even organizations that wanted to have that other type of entity to support and supplement the work that they're doing to engage voters, it's impossible. It's really, really hard to raise resources to do that work. And so, boldness around that is also, I think, something that could be really important to ensure that we are able to move people completely toward in these types of elections.
Another opportunity to be bold. Yeah. Go ahead, Lolan.
Very quickly on that question, so I've had conversations with a lot of our members who are funders around other funders pulling money that had been going to on-the-ground orgs, organizing and doing the work in order to, on the eve of this next election cycle, to protect democracy. And there's that inability or not yet making the connection around the surveillance, the targeting, the criminalization of communities as very much being linked to like the threat of democracy. And so I think for this body of folks who are engaging in these types of intersectional conversations, really being able to make that link in the spaces that we are in.
Excellent, that's a great point. Yeah, Tesmer, would you want to add, and then Natalie?
Yeah, I mean, I think that two things is, one is just to say that like even without having a C4, there's a lot that can be supported in terms of integrated voter engagement, and a lot of partners are looking at how to do that work, and what are the lines for that with challenges, particularly with some of the more recent court decisions, unfortunately. And then just the other piece to just bring in the international kind of lens around some of the threats that we have seen now, the anti-trans bills that are coming out, where a lot of them were tested in other parts of the world first, particularly in Latin America and Eastern Europe. And so these are global movements that have been testing out this messaging. There was a parental rights bill in Peru about 8-9 years ago, I think. Very similar to a lot of the parental rights bills now that we're seeing, right? So these are like, they're very well coordinated, and I know other folks have said that in terms of the opposition, but I think that this is something that we do need to invest more in and think and be working cross movement so much more in communicating, because oftentimes like repro funders or repro partners are doing all this work around opposition, and then there's all these other partners, democracy partners, who are doing this, and we're not necessarily always sharing information, and so we're not, we're not optimizing what we could be doing to push back.
Yeah, great point. Connecting the dots of what's happening overseas to what's happening here, sharing information. Yeah, excellent. Natalie?
I would just say, despite what I said earlier about things not changing a lot, particularly at the State House, I think a lot of, we are doing a lot of work around voter engagement and advocacy, and have had at least one major policy win. And I think a lot of that is about the importance of doing both and, right? So shifts are possible, they are slow, and that demands that people be willing to engage in a protracted struggle. And so a lot of times where funding is concerned with that kind of work for us and in the South, it's just like, that's a wasteland. I'm not gonna put any money there. Another thing is that there can often be low voter turnout, particularly in Mississippi, and a lot of that, again, that's systemic, right? We have an election every single year in the state of Mississippi. So that is not apathy, that is fatigue, right? There is an election every single year in the state of Mississippi. So people just get tired of showing up. You know, like, if everything is an emergency, nothing is important, right? So yeah, there are, I think it's just both and. Yeah, it's a both and.
Thank you all so much. I just, one point on this question about elections I want to make before we close. You know, elections are obviously extremely important, and they certainly have consequences, but we didn't get here over one election cycle, and we're not going to get out of here in one election cycle. We have got to be in this for the long term, and politics is one path, but it is not the only path. The path of politics and litigation is what's actually gotten us here today. The apex court of the United States of America voted against us. To change the apex court requires massive and long-term change. In the meantime, there's a lot that we can do, and that's where we need to be bold and think differently. Thank you to my panelists. Thank you all.